Times. I spent 10 years at the Los Angeles Times. And actually, I was on the business side. And what that meant was that was the side that made money. And are there any business students in here? Yes, you appreciate what I'm talking about. So one of the things about my background, so I've been on the business side of the media. I've also been in the newsroom, have reported the news, have produced the news in a TV newsroom. And then now I'm teaching about things related to news and researching and studying and so forth. So I've really had a chance, when you say I've kind of done it all, I guess in the sense that I've had an opportunity to look at it from all different sides. And most of us who have been in journalism really have kind of stayed in one part, perhaps come out of the newsroom, stayed in the newsroom. But being in the newsroom and outside the newsroom on the business side has really given me, quite a perspective on everything that's going on. When I was invited to participate in the Spring University Lecture Series, we were less than a month away from the end of the Obama era and the start of the Trump presidency. During that period, we were also learning from news reports about the emergence and influence of fake news and gaslighting during the election. And after the new president was inaugurated, his senior advisor, Kellyanne Conway, told the host of Meet the Press that the press secretary's assertion about the size of President Trump's inauguration crowd was based on alternative facts, despite the fact that there's no such thing. Before the inauguration, we also learned Russia tried to influence the outcome of the election, and President-elect Trump, just like candidate Trump, continued to keep the fact-checkers busy. But now that President Trump is in the White House, falsehoods take on new meaning. During his first month in office, the president has even tried to attach new meaning to fake news, which is not the meaning I had in mind when I decided that my lecture's title would be Why Real Journalism and Fake News Should Matter to Millennials. So with real, fake, and even alternative definitions swirling around, I'd like to avoid confusion by beginning with definitions of the terms fake news, gaslighting, alternative facts, and falsehoods. And over the course of my talk, I'll make clear why real journalism is not fake news, gaslighting, alternative facts, or falsehoods, and why this should matter to you. So, to take the definitions. Fake news. Now, fake news, the real definition of fake news, it's a con, it's a fraud, it's phony news created to look like real news, and its purpose is to deceive and manipulate you to believe something or do something you wouldn't believe or do if you knew it was fake. Gaslighting, which comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, is a psychological concept when someone is manipulating and deceiving a person so the person will question his or her own perception of reality. Gaslighting works best when it is not challenged, fact-checked, or called out for the deception that it is. Alternative facts. There may be alternative opinions and even alternative interpretations, but there's no such thing as alternative facts. And falsehoods, opposite of truth, and really a polite synonym for lie. So now that we know the definitions of these terms, let me give you some examples of falsehoods that have been uttered by the president and his circle of advisors since the inauguration. President Trump asserted that more people attended his inauguration than President Obama's inauguration. Photographic evidence has proven that assertion to be false. President Trump claimed millions of people voted illegally during the presidential election, and then there's no evidence to support that false claim. President Trump's senior advisor, Kellyanne Conway, said on national TV that there was a terrorist attack on on U.S. soil called the Bowling Green Massacre, and the press didn't cover it. It is true the press didn't cover it because the Bowling Green Massacre never happened. It's also untrue, as President Trump proclaimed in a meeting with county sheriffs, that the murder rate in our country is the highest it's been in 47 years. And it is a fact that Donald Trump lost New Hampshire by 3,000 votes to Hillary Clinton, but his assertion to U.S. senators that he lost New Hampshire because thousands of Massachusetts residents were bussed into New Hampshire to illegally vote on Election Day is just not true. President Trump's Electoral College victory was 304, but that was not the biggest Electoral College win since Ronald Reagan, as he asserted during a news conference. In fact, Washington Post fact-checkers determined that of the 9 presidential elections since 1984, Trump's Electoral College win ranked 7th. And Sweden was so surprised to learn during President Trump's campaign-style rally in Melbourne, Florida the other night, that it had suffered a terrorist attack on Friday night. And they were so surprised that a former prime minister asked what the president had been smoking. And President Trump's relentless attacks on the press, that it is dishonest, is just his opinion. But that opinion has nothing to do with the principles and process of real journalism. Unless you have been paying close attention, it's hard to keep up with White House falsehoods and press attacks. But pay close attention we must, because a free and independent press is essential to a functioning democracy and will be a key component in the kind of future your generation will inherit. That doesn't mean the press is perfect. The press makes mistakes, but its goal is to report the truth, and it has ethical standards that have guided that goal for over 90 years. So here are some of the principles that real journalists use to report real news. Real journalists do not make up the news, and they do not plagiarize. Not only will you be fired if you make up or plagiarize the news, you will never work in journalism again. Real journalists verify information from multiple credible sources before reporting it. If real journalists make a mistake, they are required to correct it immediately. All news organizations, regardless of platform, have ethical guidelines, and real journalists follow them. Real journalists use verifiable facts from credible sources. And despite what the president's senior advisor, Kellyanne Conway, said, there are only facts and there is no such thing as alternative facts. The press has a responsibility to report what the president and his staff say, and if fact-checking determines it's untrue, the press is still obligated to report the falsehood and correct the record. Unfortunately, according to the Washington Post, during the first 34 days of the Trump administration, there have been 133 false or misleading claims that have had to be corrected. Most recently, the press has been faced with correcting the president's February 17 tweet. I suspect that many of you all saw that tweet, but essentially it said, the fake news media, meaning, in the tweet, failing New York Times, NBC News, ABC, CBS, CNN, is not my enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. So he said, the fake news media is not his enemy. It is the enemy of the American people. As someone who has spent every day of my life since my very first job as a TV news reporter, either reading, watching, talking about, or sharing news and trying to encourage others, regardless of age, background, or status, to engage with news, I was deeply troubled by this tweet. I have taught journalism, I have researched and written journal articles and books about news. My millennial daughter and I started the Facebook page Millennials in News almost 6 years ago, we every day curate news from trusted news sources to encourage your generation to inform yourselves. I even proposed a news engagement day in my book, Millennials, News, and Social Media. Is news engagement a thing of the past? Because I was so worried that your generation, with its love of social media, was turning its back on news. And while I was the president of the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication in 2013 and 2014, I made my proposed idea of News Engagement Day a reality. The first Tuesday in October will mark the 4th year we have encouraged engagement with news and learning about the purpose and principles of journalism throughout the country and across the globe. President Trump's tweet that the press is the enemy of the American people is in conflict with the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. There is a reason the press is one of 5 freedoms in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. A free press is as important to our democracy as our speech, religion, assembly, and petition. Perhaps retired U.S. Admiral and University of Texas System Chancellor William H. McRaven, who is credited with organizing and overseeing the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, said it best when he brought up this tweet during his leadership speech yesterday in the Moody College of Communication. Admiral McRaven knows a thing or two about journalism because he received his degree from the UT School of Journalism in 1977. And he knows a thing or two about presidents, having served under and advised both Presidents Obama and George W. Bush. The Admiral said, "We must challenge this statement and this sentiment that the news media is the enemy of the American people." He went on to say that this sentiment may be the greatest threat to democracy in his lifetime. So that tweet, which disparages some of our best news outlets by calling them fake, is first and foremost inaccurate. And calling the news media the enemy of the American people is not only false, but it is unfortunately an example of gaslighting to undermine the news media so you will question it and ultimately not believe it. That's why the Admiral called the sentiment the greatest threat to democracy. Republican Senator John McCain of Arizona also understands the importance of a free press. That's why he said on Meet the Press this past Sunday, "We need a free press. We must have it. It's vital. If you want to preserve democracy as we know it, you have to have a free and many times adversarial press. And without it, I'm afraid that we would lose so much of our individual liberties over time. That's how dictators get started." And even though 230 years ago, Thomas Jefferson had no idea that the 45th President of the United States would call the news media the enemy of the American people, in 1787 he understood the role of a free press. The Founding Fathers said, "And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." In my 2012 book, Millennials, News, and Social Media, Is News Engagement a Thing of the Past?, I tried to imagine society without real news. And here is some of what I wrote. Without news, presidential candidates would get a free pass. They could say whatever, and there would be no one to hold them to account. Actually, no one would know what presidential candidates were saying because there would be no journalists to inform the public. If voters didn't know what candidates stood for, they would skip the election, and presidents would be elected with the tiniest number of votes. In fact, without newspapers to remind voters about an upcoming election, voters wouldn't put the election on their digital calendars and wouldn't show up at the polls. There could still be a presidential and gubernatorial debates, but who would moderate and ask questions if journalists no longer existed? Candidates could exaggerate and make untrue statements, But without journalists, who would know the assertions were overstated or false? Without journalists and news, being President of the United States would be a piece of cake. There would be no White House press corps to cover the president's every move and analyze every speech or parsed phrase. The president could start an unnecessary war, raise taxes, gut the social safety net, or nominate divisive or incompetent judges to the Supreme Court. And the people wouldn't complain because the fourth estate would no longer exist to be a check on government. The State of the Union address would become a non-news event, and the tradition of the president having the State of the Union report hand-delivered to Congress would return. Without news coverage of the State of the Union, the president could put forth a rosy or bleak state of the nation, but who would know the difference because there would be no journalists to cover it. Without the press, what would stop Wall Street investment firms and big banks from running amok? Banks might once again offer subprime mortgage loans to people who couldn't afford them. Who would know if the watchdog press weren't there to tell? Who would even know how or why the Great Recession of 2008 happened if the press hadn't been there to explain it all? Though the press has at times been asleep or acted more like a lapdog than a watchdog, eventually a free press discovered and reported the truth, even if the truth arrived late. But when there is no press, holding public officials and businesses accountable would be an impossible feat. Without newspapers, who would inform the public about new laws, policy changes, or Supreme Court rulings? Without the news media, how would people with pre-existing illnesses know, courtesy of the health care bill signed into law, that insurance companies could no longer refuse to insure them? Who would tell millennials and their parents they could breathe a sigh of relief thanks to the health care bill? How else would they have known that the maximum age to remain in a parent's health insurance had been increased to age 26? Or how would, without the news, would the flying public know of a potentially traumatizing encounter with a body scanner at the airport? Without the local news, who would tell the public which are the best and worst schools, or that school districts are laying off teachers and increasing class sizes? How would the public know about the most dangerous roads and intersections? Who would inform the public about recalls of unsafe products or tainted meats, canned goods, or even fresh produce? Without the news, who would tell the public about corruption, abuse, or crime? And how would the public know about devastating earthquakes and tsunamis and how to help victims? Without the news, good news would be a best-kept secret. If journalism disappears, who would tell about convicted felons who had been exonerated after being wrongly incarcerated for decades? Who would shine a light on the public good and people who are making a difference? Who would inform the public about the noble work of nonprofits and small businesses that are filling unique niches? How would the public know about innovation and scientific and medical advances? Who would keep the public posted on competitiveness in the global economy? How would the public know if the U.S. is winning the future, to use President Obama's phrasing in his 2011 State of the Union address? Without the news, how would the public know about the results of a presidential primary, general, or midterm election? Who would inform us of the latest public opinion polls, presidential approval ratings, or how communities may have changed based on the most recent U.S. Census? Without news to read, watch, or listen to, everyone would be ignorant of events, both important and not so important. The loss of news would not just take a societal and cultural toll. If news disappeared, individuals would be affected because for some, the process of reading, watching, listening to, and talking about news is integral to the lives they lead. Without news, people would feel less sure, less secure, and a little lost. It's comforting to know that journalists are monitoring the environment to inform us if something is amiss, or if there's nothing to worry about. While the latest goings-on inside the Beltway may dominate the network evening news, the front page of the New York Times and the cable talking heads, news news is so much more than a nation's capital, and that's why there would be a void in our collective daily lives if news was no longer available. The news warns of dangerous weather patterns on the horizon. It informs us of school and office closings due to blizzards, ice storms, and wildfires. The news tells us when to carry an umbrella, or if it's going to be a bad hair day because of high humidity. News alerts allergy sufferers when to expect to be miserable. The news also advises us when to take an alternate route because of a mile-long traffic tie-up on the main freeway. News also highlights what's happening around town. It helps us decide whether or not to spend money on a new film that's opening on the weekend. The news also tells football and basketball fans if their team won or lost and the reasons why. And because of the news, we know the Grammys and Oscar winners and the upsets too. Just as a good neighbor keeps a watchful eye on your home or apartment when you're away, news reports where bank robberies, assaults, murders, and even arsons occurred while you were sleeping. Danger can come in all forms. It might be a boating accident, a drowning at the city pool, a death at a daycare center, a financial scam, predators on the internet. The news keeps us updated and on guard. Newspapers not only deliver the news, they are there for us in times of grief. Newspapers both help us get the word out and keep us informed of death. With a cherished photo and carefully crafted prose, newspaper obituaries recognize the life and legacy of a loved one. And with its online counterparts, friends far beyond the circulation area can read the obituary and leave a comment that recalls a memory or expresses sympathy. With dignity and discretion, newspaper obituaries can also communicate family preferences for donations to charities in lieu of flowers. For TV news to observe a passing, some level of fame must have been achieved, even if it's less than 15 minutes. When TV notes the death of someone famous or infamous, the news might get a few seconds of a newscast or crawl on the bottom line. If it's a major figure, such as a former president, TV will break in with the news. In fact, if news disappears, so will breaking news. We'll never again know about news that was so important it couldn't wait to be told. If news disappears, we will no longer have the benefit of expert and sometimes humorous commentary and context that we find on newspapers' editorial and opinion pages. Even the editorial cartoon would disappear, and we'll miss out on that visual zinger that, through its simplicity and sophistication, evokes a raised eyebrow, head nod, or knowing smile. Without news, how would we connect to and make sense of the world beyond our door? Without news to commemorate history, provide context, and mark events seared in our mind's eye, how would we pass on what we stand for to the next generation? Without news, citizens would be unable to fulfill their civic responsibility of being informed. Without news, professionals would not just feel out of touch, they would be disadvantaged in the marketplace. Without news, the sense of empowerment that accompanies being informed would be in short supply. Without news, what would Malcolm Gladwell's mavens and connectors talk about? Without news, what would any of us talk and tweet about? There would be so much less to post on Facebook, and life would be boring. Without news, our society would no longer have an informed public, making it harder to hold businesses, public officials, institutions, and the news media accountable. The educational system would decline at an even faster rate, diminishing our ability to be the world leader in a global economic competition. Our freedoms would be at risk, threatening our democracy and the symbol of hope that America stands for around the world. Without news, we wouldn't be able to heed the advice and warning of Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Bob Woodward when he was a guest on Oprah during its final season. He said, "You have to be informed. You get into trouble when you don't pay attention." When news is doing its job, it can get you out of trouble and much more. When news is at its best, it doesn't just inform, it establishes common ground. It surprises and inspires us. At then Columbine, 9/11, Katrina, the BP Gulf Coast oil spill, Wall Street bonuses, and the U.S. debt ceiling crisis that had Americans and citizens around the world wondering if Washington was capable of putting the public good ahead of self-interest. At its best, news fascinates. When news is doing its job, it enables us to vicariously experience the past and present and to imagine a future that has yet to arrive. When news is doing its job, it looks after the public good. When news is at its best, it not only provides information that people need to be free and self-governing, it also provides what the Commission on Freedom of the Press, also known as the Hutchins Committee, noted more than 6 decades ago when the parents of the millennial generation were born. Our society needs an accurate, truthful account of the day's events. We need to know what's going on in our own locality, region, and nation. We need reliable information about all other countries. We need to supply other countries with such information about ourselves. We need a marketplace for the exchange of comment and criticism regarding public affairs. We need to reproduce on a gigantic scale the open argument which characterized the village gathering 2 centuries ago. We need to project across all groups, regions, and nations a picture of the constituent elements of the modern world. We need to clarify the aims and ideals of our community and every other. Captures what I imagine our society would be like without news. But that's only part of the equation, because news can be available, but that doesn't mean people pay attention to it. That's why our society also needs to make becoming informed from credible news outlets a top priority. Over half a century ago, 86% of adults read a daily newspaper, and newspaper reading was considered a thoroughly institutionalized behavior. Today, according to my most recent national survey, only 38% of millennials get news daily, and only 23% seek news daily. Furthermore, because millennials primarily get their news from social media, they can't always remember the source of the story. They don't know if the story is real news produced by a credible news organization or fake. So while society needs an accurate, truthful account of the day's events, and the public needs to make becoming informed a top priority, it's also important to know that fake news, alternative facts, and falsehoods lurk in the media landscape, trying to deceive us, so we must protect ourselves. And how do we protect ourselves? So here are a few recommendations for protecting yourself against news that may be fake. Since I primarily get my news from news apps on my smartphone, I asked my students who mostly get their news from social media what they thought was the best defense against fake news. They said, and I agree, that first and foremost, the source of the news must be checked to know it's legitimate. Your local daily newspaper and TV stations are legitimate sources of news. And the mainstream news outlets where Republicans, Democrats, and Independents got their news during the presidential election are also legitimate. I personally get news from at least a dozen news outlets every day, including NBC, the New York Times, NPR, the Washington Post, CNN, USA Today, the Los Angeles Times, and the BBC. When getting news, it is also important to make sure it is news and not opinion. While opinion may be based on news, opinion is not news, and it should be labeled as such. The important thing to remember is real news uses ethical reporting methods, and opinion masquerading as news is not condoned. News is verified from multiple independent and credible sources and checked by editors before it's reported to the public. And it's important to know that a free and independent press is not the enemy of the American people, but what a sociologist calls a window to the world, journalists call a watchdog, and my colleagues and I call a good neighbor. As a window to the world, the press tells us what we want to know, need to know, and should know. As a watchdog for the American people, a free press independently and honestly reports on powerful people and institutions to fulfill the purpose of journalism, which the authors of the Elements of Journalism say is to provide us with the information we need to be free and self-governed. And as a good neighbor, a free and independent press is first and foremost looking out for you, your interests, and the public good. Thank you. Okay, so I know you all have a lot of questions, yes? So who's going to ask the first question?
Why do you think that President Trump doesn't call Fox News and Breitbart fake news?
How many of you watch Fox News? So one of the things about Fox News, how many of you are familiar with the Pew Research Center and the reports that they do? And they regularly provide surveys of the media and so forth, and also, the election and every possible thing you can imagine, because they have a lot of money to do surveys. So they did, in one of their surveys after the election, they asked people where they got their news. And so Fox was on that list. So were the places that I just mentioned. And so one of the things about Fox News is Fox News, their motto is what? I know you know this. Fair and balanced? Yeah. Okay, this is what they say. They're fair and balanced. They're not fair and balanced, okay? And they should say they're not fair and balanced, and that's okay because they report from a perspective. And they report from a conservative perspective. And, that's perfectly okay. But one of the things, and I think it's the case with Fox News, the cable channel, also CNN, the cable channel, and MSNBC, that because in a lot of their programs, they have mixed up a lot of talking head, opinion type people, political strategists, etc., that they're in the mix, with journalists, that it's really kind of hard to know who's saying what. So a lot of the stuff that they have on there is opinion from a point of view. A lot of the stuff that CNN and MSNBC have, because they also have these political strategists who bring in their perspective. So I know that's a long answer to your question, but the bottom line is, I suspect the ones that he follows and he's happy with, then he's not going to call them fake news. And I think one of the most important things that if, in the case of the mainstream media, if you're being criticized, you're probably doing something right. And it is the responsibility. So it's not the responsibility to do cover pieces. That's not the responsibility, certainly when it comes to the president, Congress, et cetera, et cetera. That's not the responsibility. The responsibility is to be a watchdog and report the news. And President Trump isn't unusual. Probably every president has hated how they have been covered. But what is unusual is that he's saying some of the things that he's saying about the press. And it is problematic because at the same time, when he was sworn in to defend the U.S. Constitution, and in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it talks about our freedoms, and the press is right there with the other four freedoms. And so it's problematic and a problem. And so I think it would be helpful if he could begin to understand the purpose of the press and a democracy. And so we'll see. Maybe you will.
Thank you.
Question?
So we're in the information age, and academia can obviously work with a lot of other academic institutions. And we have machine learning. Why don't we have a singular source of objective universal laws? Engineers obviously derive equations from those mathematicians. Why don't we have a singular source, just like we have water that's filtered?
A
Why don't we have
singular source
information?
of what?
Well, why can't we filter our information through a truth metric is my whole point. Like, why don't we have a singular source digitally or whatever type of system that works that uses all the collective truth that we have to this point from the beginning of time until now.
Okay, so, and I apologize. Let me get your name, and then I'm going. So you're, why don't you tell us?
My name's Eric.
Okay, and
I'm a business major.
you're a business major, and so your name.
My name's Eric as well.
And so what's your area?
I'm computer engineering.
Okay, okay. So you want to know why don't we have one source of the news?
Why don't we have truth? So truth is, there's a lot of objective truths. That's what we study in engineering. That's what they study in mathematics. It's a thing that connects everybody. Doesn't matter what religion you are, ethnicity. It's an objective truth. It's a universal law. So why don't we have those collective universal laws in a singular source? So when people make just whatever type of statement they want based on opinion, we can then check it with that source. Just like you filter your water before you drink it. Just like you have organizations that check your food to make sure it's not toxic. Why don't we have an information source to make sure that whatever we're reading and possibly creating reality dysmorphia is also
Personally, I would not want a single source, okay? I really would not. And
we can't have multiple sources, right? You said no alternative facts, right? So there's got to be one source.
Well, I mean, we know that there's no such thing as there's a fact.
Right. Which makes one source.
So there's the fact. If we were to count the number of people in this room, then we would have a fact, the total number. I don't know how many people are in this room, but that would become a fact. We probably have to double check it and triple check it, and several people would need to count. But we would come to a conclusion about the number of people. And so if someone reported on that, they could use that fact, how many students attended this event, and that's the fact. But you can't come up with, what's the alternative to the fact of X number of people attended the event? There is no such thing. Now, you could very well say, and I know that you all don't do this in engineering, you may say that, oh, it looked like it was at least 100. So it's at least 100. So that's kind of an estimate, but it's not, it's kind of a fuzzy fact, but it's not an alternative. But the bottom line is, to answer your question, I certainly would not want it. And it couldn't happen because of the First Amendment anyway. Because the press is included in the First Amendment, then you can't do anything to, well, there are a few things, but not too much, can't do anything to decide how the press is going to operate. So you want the press to operate like engineering, and a free press is going to operate the way a free press wants to operate. And the thing that is so beautiful today that you all are experiencing, that your parents should ask them. So ask your parents and your grandparents about the news they got coming up. So they're probably growing up. They probably had ABC, NBC, CBS. They didn't even have CNN and Fox and so forth because they probably hadn't started yet. So they had the networks, they had their local newspaper, and today I read the news, engage with the news on my smartphone. So all of those different places that I've mentioned that I go to, I have apps on my smartphone. So I have all of this diversity on my smartphone, and I think it's wonderful. It's wonderful for everybody. But the Constitution would not allow you to say we're only going to have one.
That wasn't my question, though, what you just explained. My statement was, in engineering, we have all the engineers that came before us, right? We stand on the shoulders of giants. That's how we are here where we are today. You have Isaac Newton, all the different universal laws he found. We build mathematical equations on top of those things as we progress society. My point was, why don't we have a collective knowledge base of humanity in a one singular location? It doesn't have to be associated with a press. Anyone can use it.
It's
a database of information.
You can get it through the internet. I mean, you can go to all
It
these
needs to
places,
be
but
one source.
it's going to be one platform.
One platform, one
So you
source.
can go, use your phone to go to all of these places through the internet and have access to everything. But it's still not going to be just one because everybody's going to have their own perspective.
I think what he's getting at is like fact checkers.
Correct.
Oh, there, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying
But
a
there are fact
collection
checkers. I'll tell you about that.
a collection of facts.
If they're
So
fact checkers.
anytime someone says something, we can just go to a singular place
I
and
didn't
find
understand that was your question.
if that was true or not. If it's not true, then we say, okay,
You
that's
know
not
what?
true.
You can go to, right now, fact checkers are the hottest thing going. Okay? go to the Washington Post is one. So you can go to their fact checking. There's PolitiFact. So everybody's fact checking now. So that's not a problem if you need to have something checked. Did I say another thing? Go ahead.
So quick question, you're talking about how like Trump is,
Can you
yeah. So
tell us who you are?
Shrikar, I'm a business major,
Okay.
and you're talking about how like Trump isn't really working with the media, he's like calling them out, saying they're the enemy of the American people, right? So I'm just curious as to like,
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble.
you're fine. I'm just gonna ask you like, I'm curious as to what do you think Trump's gonna do about the media in the future? Like, do you think he's gonna like maintain his stance, or do you think he's gonna like change in the future? Like, do something about the media? Like,
You mean the attitude toward the media?
yeah. Like, what do you think he's gonna do in the future?
I have no idea. I mean, do you all have any idea?
I think it's better to continue, honestly.
Well, you know, part of it is for intimidation, thinking that he can intimidate the news media, and the news media will stop reporting or will give him the reporting that he wants. But that's not the role of the news media, so that's not going to change. Okay.
So,
What's your name?
I'm Drew, I'm also a business major.
A lot of business majors. Come over here. Go ahead.
So, obviously they're very different, like, biases in media. There's a liberal bias and conservative bias and all the sources. In your opinion, what would you say the most politically moderate source of news is?
The most what, politically moderate?
Yeah, the most politically moderate source.
Well, let me say this, that everyone has biases, right? We all have our own personal biases. But what is different for journalists, you know, journalists recognize they may have some biases inside, but they're professionals just like you're professionals. So when you are reporting, what you are trying to do is to get at the truth. And, you know, one of the things you all know about, you weren't around with Watergate, but you know about Watergate, right? So that particular story, I mean, it took a long time to tell that story. And eventually, you know, there were hearings, and with the congressional hearings, they had subpoena power, so they were able to get information that they could. But it takes a long time to tell a story. So when a reporter is reporting a story, recognizing, okay, I may have some bias about this, but that's not going to enter in the story because I'm trying to be a professional. So that's the goal, to be a professional and to report a story. Without question, and I know that people like to say, you know, the New York Times has a liberal bias and Fox, as I just said, has a conservative, and they do, and they should be proud of it because that's what they do. But most of the mainstream media in the middle, that they are really just trying to report the news and to go wherever it takes them. And you don't really know sometimes where it's going to end up. So, and that's not the answer that you wanted, but that's just kind of reality. You know what the best thing to do? The best thing to do is to read from a lot of different sources. That's the best thing. Because the other thing, and I hope that you all, in fact, you have your phones here, that you all will check out Millennials and News, which I mentioned. So it's a Facebook page every day that my daughter and I are curating the most up-to-date news from the same sources from the news outlets that I just mentioned. And so one of the things, when you look at a lot of different sources, you can see, so how did the New York Times cover this story? How did NPR, that may be a good place for you to go. How did NPR cover this story? How did CNN cover this story? And one of the things that you're going to find, that when it's a big story, they're all covering it about the same. Because it's really about truth and it's not about, there may be one that's covering it different. We won't mention that name. Go ahead.
My name is Frank. Thank you so much for your lecture. I was curious what advice you would give to a journalist or a news agency who is being derided or commented on by the president as offering fake news when they are a long-term, legitimately credentialed news source.
Well, you know, the news organizations are really, really struggling with this because they're
We have time for one more question, Dr.
My name is Matthew. I'm a government history major, and my question is a little bit different. It's a little bit long, so I apologize. I'll try to condense it. At the beginning of your lecture, you said that today millennials are a little unsure, or most millennials are unsure of like where their source is. So it's kind of like this bunch of information that people get and they just absorb and they repeat without knowing for sure. Everyone's more increasingly polarized, so we get our sources from places we agree with, either right or left wing. Breitbart, Fox News on the right, and then like places like Huffington Post on the left. So in a situation like that, where media is gaining increasing political power over an entire generation, and that influences us, media is only held accountable to their sales, how many people read it. Politicians are held accountable to elections. At what point would somebody like Trump be totally morally justified in attacking media and trying to wrest at least a little bit more control back into the hands of government to give information if media is being held unaccountable themselves?
Well, he certainly has a right to, because, the same kind of come up the press is in the First Amendment, so is speech. So he certainly has a right to do that. But I don't think that, first thing, I would say it is not really accurate to say that the media is getting more and more control over your generation. And the reason for that is that every generation, and when they are young adults, they are less likely to engage with the news. So, and I didn't show my